Sometimes you realize the solution to our biggest problems isn't some brand new invention, but an idea that's been forgotten. So let's dive into a story from the world of beekeeping that proves exactly that. It's about a playbook for survival, one that was written a long time ago, then kind of got lost, and is now finally being rediscovered.
Everything kicks off with an ultimatum. Imagine this. For young Dr. John Kefus, this wasn't just some hobby. It was a challenge that would set him on a lifelong quest. That one sentence from his wife was the spark. The stakes, well, they couldn't have been any higher. It was either figure it out or give it up for good.
Now, when we talk about threats to bees today, I bet one name jumps right into your head: the Varroa mite. But before Varroa became this headline villain, beekeepers were fighting a totally different and just as devastating war.
And this was the enemy, American foulbrood, or AFB. It's this incredibly infectious bacterial disease that could turn a healthy, buzzing hive into a sticky, foul-smelling mess. It would just wipe out entire apiaries. For beekeepers back then, finding a hive with AFB was an absolute death sentence. They often had to burn everything: their colonies, the boxes, the whole shebang.
But even in the face of a crisis like that, there were a few pioneers who just refused to accept defeat. They had this idea. They believed the answer wasn't just about treating the sick bees, but about finding the bees that were naturally strong enough to survive on their own.
And this whole idea of breeding for resistance, it's not new at all. It has this really rich history that you can see right here. It all starts back in the 1930s with O.W. Park's initial research. By the 40s, he had proved that this thing called hygienic behavior, basically the bee's natural instinct to clean out disease, was genetic. It was something they passed down. Then, in the 60s, a guy named Dr. Walter Rothenbuhler took that foundational knowledge and really refined it.
And the results? They were absolutely staggering. Over 14 years, just using simple selection in what's called an open-mated setting. We're not talking about complex, isolated lab controls here. O.W. Park achieved a 98% survival rate in his colonies, and that's even when they were intentionally infected with AFB. Just let that sink in for a second. Nearly perfect survival just by consistently choosing the strongest bees.
So what's really important to get here is that resistance breeding isn't about creating some kind of super bee in a lab. It's much simpler. It's about partnering with nature. It's about looking at the bees, finding the ones that already have the tools to fight back, and then just making sure their genetics get passed on. But this story isn't just about the data. It's really about the people. Dr. Walter Rothenbuhler, the guy we just saw in the timeline, he wasn't just a brilliant geneticist. He was a mentor whose quiet influence would end up echoing for decades.
This quote really tells you everything you need to know about the man's character. He wasn't some scientist locked away in an ivory tower. No, he invited his students right into the process. He taught them to think critically by having them look over his own work. He was building the next generation of thinkers. And he was wonderfully unpretentious. This little story just paints such a great picture, doesn't it? Here's this foundational figure in bee genetics, driving a car with a hole in the floor, and he'd just joke about it. His focus was totally on the work, not on appearances. So for a young John Kefus who was working as a lab tech for him, these were just incredibly powerful, practical lessons. He learned that knowledge is pretty useless if it just stays in a book, that mistakes, they're your best teachers. And maybe most importantly, and this is my favorite, it's always cheaper to learn those hard lessons on someone else's dime.
Dr. Kefus sums up the whole learning process perfectly with this unforgettable quote, right? Some of us learn by reading, some by watching, and then some of us just have to learn things the hard way. It's a hilarious but totally profound truth about experience being the ultimate teacher.
Okay, so this brings us right to the central question of this whole story. If O.W. Park had a 98% success rate against AFB all the way back in the 40s, if these methods were proven to work, why on earth aren't they the standard practice for beekeepers today?
Why did we take this incredible playbook and just put it on a shelf to gather dust? Well, the answer isn't really about science. It's about people. It's about human nature. See, it all came down to a choice between two very different philosophies. Selection, that's the long game. It builds real, lasting resilience, but it takes patience and it takes work. Treatment, on the other hand, that offers a quick, easy fix. It feels like you're doing something right away, but it just creates this endless cycle of dependence. So what tipped the scales? Dr. Kefus calls it the mañana effect. Why do today what you can just put off until tomorrow? Beekeepers were scared of losing money in the short term. They were told it was pointless, that they couldn't possibly succeed, so they just waited for someone else to solve the problem for them. And the quick fix of antibiotics became the norm.
And this is where all that history really pays off. Because when the Varroa mite showed up and created a whole new crisis, Dr. Kefus was ready. All those lessons he learned decades earlier in Rothenbuhler's lab gave him the confidence and the tools he needed to tackle a modern plague.
This slide here breaks down that path to innovation just perfectly. It's a simple formula, really. First, Kefus gained confidence from a great mentor. Second, he learned a solid foundational technique. And then, finally, when a new problem came along, he didn't panic. He just applied the old playbook to a new fight. A perfect example is something called the freeze-brood test. It's a beautifully simple method. You just freeze a section of brood in the hive and time how quickly the bees clean it all out. It's a direct, practical way to measure that super important hygienic behavior. This isn't some high-tech lab equipment. It's a tool passed down straight from the pioneers, and it's just as powerful today for any beekeeper who wants to select for Varroa resistance.
So as we start to wrap this up, the question for us isn't really whether the science works. I mean, we know it does. The real question is one of mindset. It's about us.
Dr. Kefus just hits the nail on the head here. The biggest barrier isn't a lack of information or a lack of resources. It's a lack of boldness. It's that fear of trying something different, of taking a risk, of trusting the process even when it's slow.
Ultimately, this whole journey teaches us one really big thing, and it applies way beyond beekeeping. The goal isn't to find another magic bullet. It's about a complete philosophical shift. It's about moving from being a treater who just reacts to problems to being a selector who actively partners with natural resilience. Yeah, it's the harder path, but it's the one that actually lasts. And that leaves us with this final thought. The playbook for breeding resistant, resilient bees, it was never really lost. It was just set aside. The knowledge is right there, waiting. So the only question that remains is who's going to be bold enough to pick it up and write the next chapter.